The trauma bay fell completely silent the moment the monitor flatlined. 40 seconds. No pulse, no response. The attending physician stepped back and reached for the time of death clipboard. Then a suspended nurse, a woman who had been escorted out of that same hospital 6 hours earlier, pushed through the doors, crossed the room without permission, bent close to the unconscious soldier's ear, and whispered a single word. His fingers moved. The surgeon froze. The military liaison grabbed the doorframe. A federal agent standing near the back wall pulled out his phone and said nothing, just watched. Because that word wasn't a prayer. It was a classified military protocol that no one in that room was supposed to know. And the man who had ordered her suspension looked like he'd just seen something he was never meant to survive. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit that button, turn on your notifications, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Stories like this one don't stop at borders, and neither do the people in them. Like this video if you're already hooked, because what happens next in this trauma bay is going to change everything you think you know about who gets dismissed and who ends up being the only person in the room who can save a life. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Ardmore Regional Medical Center sat on the east edge of a mid-sized city that had never quite decided what it wanted to be, part Rust Belt recovery, part medical corridor, part forgotten stretch of highway that pharmaceutical companies had quietly colonized over the past decade. The hospital itself was 11 stories of gray concrete and reflective glass, the kind of building that looked impressive from the freeway but felt suffocating the moment you stepped through the automatic doors. The nursing staff called the fourth floor the pressure cooker. Not because of the patient load, though that was brutal enough. Because of the politics. Because of the invisible hierarchy that operated alongside the official one. The one that decided whose concerns got documented and whose got quietly buried in the shift change shuffle. Nora Callahan had worked that floor for 3 years. Before Ardmore, before the compression stockings and the 12-hour shifts in the smell of antiseptic that never quite left her hair, she'd spent 4 years as a forward-deployed Army combat medic attached to units whose names she still wasn't permitted to say in most company. She'd run triage in forward operating bases with failing generators and questionable water supply. She'd worked alongside special operations teams in environments that would give most hospital administrators a complete breakdown, and she'd done it without losing a patient she could have saved. That last part mattered to her in a way she'd never found the right words for. She was 31 years old, built lean from years of carrying heavy equipment across rough ground, and she had a way of going very still under pressure that most of the fourth floor staff mistook for coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was the opposite. It was the particular stillness of someone who had learned, in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. That panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Most mornings she arrived 7 minutes early, checked the overnight chart notes on her assigned patients before the outgoing shift finished handoff, and started her rounds with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her invisible to the people who weren't paying attention. The ones who weren't paying attention were usually the ones with the most authority. The medication error she caught that Tuesday morning wasn't subtle. It wasn't a rounding difference or a transcription ambiguity that a reasonable person could defend. It was the kind of order that shouldn't have cleared pharmacy review, shouldn't have been printed on a discharge summary, and absolutely should not have carried doctor. Gerald Ashton's digital authorization. The patient was Warren Tilley, 63 years old, 3 days post-cardiac procedure, stable but fragile in the particular way that post-surgical cardiac patients were fragile, the kind of stability that required careful management and could turn on a single misread lab value. He was scheduled for discharge within 48 hours. His chart showed a heparin order attached to his pre-discharge protocol. The dosage was, by any reasonable reading of his current morning labs, dangerous, not marginally elevated, not on the edge of a clinical judgment call. Dangerous in a way that, given his current INR levels, created a real and measurable risk of hemorrhagic event. Nora flagged it at 8:42 in the morning. The charge nurse on duty, a careful woman named Pat Moreno, who had worked the fourth floor for 11 years, and understood the hospital's invisible hierarchies as well as anyone, told her to double-check the order before making any calls. Nora had already double-checked it twice. She'd pulled Tilly's full chart, cross-referenced his INR trend across 4 days of labs, run a Doge calculation that took her less than 30 seconds, and arrived at the same conclusion both times. The number was wrong. Badly, specifically, dangerously wrong. She called pharmacy at 8:47. The pharmacist on duty told her the order had come in with attending physician authorization and had been flagged to the nursing floor for confirmation prior to administration standard protocol for orders in the high caution category. "I'm the floor nurse," Nora said, "and I'm not confirming it. The dosage is contraindicated given his current labs." A pause that lasted a beat too long. "You'll need to take that up with Dr. Ashton directly." She found Ashton in the hallway outside the attending physician's lounge at 9:03, coffee in one hand, tablet in the other, scrolling something that was clearly not a patient chart. He was tall, mid-50s, silver at the temples, wearing the specific variety of relaxed authority that came from a decade of being the highest compensated person in any given room and knowing it. He didn't look up when she said his name. Dr. Ashton. "Warren Tilly's discharge order, the heparin dosage needs review." Pharmacy signed off on it. Pharmacy flagged it for nursing confirmation before administration. "I'm the nurse, and I'm not confirming it. His INR moved this morning." The order wasn't updated to reflect current labs. He looked up, not with concern, with the specific expression of a man who had classified this as an interruption before she'd finished sentences. "His values are within acceptable parameters for that order." They were within acceptable parameters 4 days ago. His morning draw changed the picture. The order was written before those results came back. A beat of silence. His eyes moved back to the tablet. "I'll take another look when I have a moment. He's in pre-discharge prep in 2 hours. If someone runs that order before you've reviewed it." I said I'll look at it. The edge in his voice was quiet and deliberate, the kind of tone that was calibrated to end conversations without technically raising itself. "Thank you, Nurse Callahan." She stood there for a moment. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then she turned around, went back to the floor, sat at the nursing station, and wrote a formal clinical concern notation in Tilly's chart, time-stamped, detailed, citing the specific lab values from that morning's draw, the specific dosage on the order, and the specific risk pathway given his current coagulation profile. She filed it with the charge nurse and with the unit supervisor, a man named Doug Herrera, who had an office at the end of the hall and was reliably unhelpful in situations that involved confronting and attending. Pat read the notation, said okay, and filed it. Herrera didn't call back. At 11:06, a pharmacy tech appeared on the floor with Tilly's medication cart. Nora was at the nursing station. She was on her feet before the tech had made it to the third doorway. "I'm holding that order," she said. The tech, young, tired-looking, clearly not interested in being in the middle of whatever this was, stopped walking. "I have authorization from the attending physician, and I have a formal clinical safety notation in the patient's chart documenting a specific contraindication concern. That medication doesn't go in until Dr. Ashton reviews the updated labs in person, or until a second attending cosigns a revised order. You can call the pharmacy supervisor to escalate." The tech called the pharmacy supervisor. The pharmacy supervisor called the floor charge nurse. The charge nurse called Herrera. Herrera called Ashton. And by 11:14, Gerald Ashton was walking onto the fourth floor with his jaw set and Deborah Falk beside him, the hospital's chief nursing officer, a woman with the narrow, watchful energy of someone who had built her career by making problems disappear before they became visible. The conversation that followed lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Nora presented her documentation, the notation, the lab values, the calculation, the timeline. Ashton said her reading of the lab trend was clinically incorrect. Falk said Nora had created a disruption to the care team's workflow and had circumvented physician authority by physically blocking the medication delivery. I didn't circumvent anything, Nora said. I followed the patient safety reporting protocol exactly as written. The pharmacist flagged the order for nursing confirmation. I declined to confirm it. That's the process working. You obstructed a medication delivery, Falk said, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone reading from a decision she'd already made. That constitutes insubordination. Obstructing is a strong word for standing in a hallway. Falk's expression didn't change. You're suspended, pending a formal review. Please surrender your badge to the charge nurse. Nora looked down the hallway toward Tilly's room. Has anyone reviewed the updated labs and amended the order? Nobody answered that. She pulled her badge from her lanyard, set it on the nursing station desk, picked up her bag from the break room, and walked out through the side entrance of Ardmore Regional Medical Center at 11:37 in the morning. Outside, the air was cold and tasted like rain that hadn't quite arrived yet. She walked to her car, put the bag in the back seat, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The hospital entrance was visible in her rearview mirror, the glass doors sliding open and shut, people moving in and out, the ordinary mechanical rhythm of a building that would keep running whether or not she was in it. She had done everything correctly. She'd followed the protocol, filed the documentation, raised the concern through every appropriate channel available to her, and done it all without raising her voice. And she'd been suspended for it. She knew this feeling. She'd felt it before, in different contexts, in different buildings, in situations where doing the right thing had cost her something she hadn't budgeted for. The feeling wasn't rage. It was something more exhausting than rage. It was the particular weight of being dismissed by the very systems you'd believed in enough to follow. She started the car and drove 2 miles to a diner she liked because it was quiet on weekdays and the coffee was reliably hot. She was on her second cup when the call came in. Unknown number. She almost didn't pick up. Then she did, because she always picked up unknown numbers and had never once been able to explain why to anyone's satisfaction. Nora Callahan? Male voice. Even imprecise, the kind of measured delivery that suggested military or law enforcement not threatening, just trained. Speaking. This is Warrant Officer Dale Pruitt, U.S. Army Liaison, assigned to Ardmore Regional Medical. I need you to return to the hospital immediately. She set her coffee down. I was suspended this morning. I'm aware. This isn't an administrative request. We had a military transport arrive 14 minutes ago. Critical patient. Special operations. The trauma team is running into a problem they can't identify, and your name came up as a specific resource. My name came up how? A pause. Brief and careful. The kind of pause that meant the person on the other end was choosing words specifically. The patient's field record included a medical designation tag. That tag links to a classified service file. Your service file. I don't have the clearance to say more than that on this line. She was already reaching for her jacket. I'll be there in 8 minutes. The ambulance bay at Ardmore Regional didn't look like itself when she pulled up. 2 vehicles that were unmistakably military, regardless of their absence of markings, sat at angles to the main entrance. 4 people in civilian clothes were stationed at intervals around the bay in the particular configuration of people trained to be watchful without looking like they were watching. A federal agency vehicle, dark blue, no plates she recognized, was parked at the far end of the lot with someone still in the driver's seat. Nora badged in through the side service entrance, using a temp credential that a colleague she trusted had left at the security desk without any questions being asked or answered. The trauma bay was on the ground floor, west corridor, third door. She could hear it before she reached it, the controlled, overlapping voices of a team working a patient they weren't winning. She pushed through the door. The man on the table was somewhere in his late 30s. She could tell, even through the injuries and the pallor, that he had the particular physical composition of someone who did sustained, brutal, functional work for a living not gym-built, field-built. The kind of muscle that came from years of carrying weight across difficult terrain. His face was gray. His breathing was shallow and labored, rhythm irregular, in a way that didn't match any of the documented injuries on the whiteboard beside the table. 2 IVs running, an airway adjunct in place. His left arm wrapped heavily from elbow to wrist. The attending trauma surgeon was Dr. Renata Fowler, a compact, sharp-focused woman Nora had worked alongside before and respected without qualification. Fowler was at the head of the table with a neuroassessment tablet in her hand and the expression of someone who had ruled out 3 explanations and found nothing useful behind any of them. Pupils are sluggish but reactive, Fowler was saying, to no one specifically. GCS is fluctuating between 9 and 11. Preliminary scan shows no structural bleed. He's not responding to standard arousal protocol, but his brain activity on the monitor isn't suppressed, it's active. Something's blocking the connection. Nora moved to the left side of the table without announcing herself. His eyes were open, not the fixed glassy open of a patient whose lights were going out, not the unfocused drift of someone sedated into distance. They were moving, tracking, slow, working hard against something, but present in a way that the rest of his body wasn't reflecting. He was in there, fully in there, trapped behind something that had nothing to do with his injuries. "What's his name?" she asked. Fowler glanced at her without breaking rhythm. "Captain Dwight Sauer, Army. That's the extent of what I've been given." Nora reached past the IV stand and pulled the pre-hospital field documentation from the tablet mount on the wall. Those notes were abbreviated, they always were, when a transport came in, under whatever classification had brought this one in. But the medication log was there. She scrolled through it. Vitals on scene, field stabilization, airway management, and there, near the bottom of the administered compounds list, a designation that made her stop scrolling. She knew that compound. She knew it the way you know something you encountered under circumstances specific enough that the knowledge never fully detached from the context in which you learned it. It wasn't a standard pharmaceutical. It wasn't on any civilian formulary she'd ever seen. It had a particular mechanism of action that was designed to suppress voluntary neurological responses while leaving autonomic function largely intact, which was exactly why Sauer's brain was active on the monitor, while his body couldn't follow his own instructions. Somebody had put it in his system deliberately. Before the transport, before he arrived, her stomach dropped in the specific way it dropped when a situation reclassified itself in her mind from bad to something with a different category of implications. She leaned in close to Sauer's left ear. She didn't pause to think about it. The recognition was already complete. The compound, the mechanism, the protocol that had been developed specifically to work around it. It lived in muscle memory from a different chapter of her life, one she'd spent 3 years not referencing in casual conversation. She said the word quietly, exactly the way she'd been trained to say it. Lockbridge. His right hand closed into a fist. Deliberate. Controlled. The kind of movement that took effort and intention. The cardiac monitor shifted. Not dramatically, no sudden spikes, no cinematic recovery. Just a measurable, real change. His blood pressure climbed 4 points. His respiratory rhythm evened slightly. His jaw tightened. Fowler looked at the monitor, then at Nora. "What did you just do?" Classified neuroresponse protocol. Verbal stimulus keyed to a specific neurological pathway. Nora kept her voice level. He's not unconscious from the injuries. He's been chemically suppressed. That compound in the field log, it's a restricted neurological agent used in specific military research programs. It's not in the civilian pharmacopoeia. Whoever documented his pre-hospital treatment either added it after the fact or it was administered before extraction. She paused. Someone put it in his system to keep him non-responsive. The room went quiet, not the quiet of an empty room. The quiet of a space where 8 people have simultaneously stopped doing what they were doing because something just changed the architecture of the situation. Fowler said carefully, "You're saying this patient was intentionally drugged to prevent him from regaining consciousness." That's exactly what I'm saying. That is an extraordinarily serious accusation. The voice came from the doorway, composed, weighted, landing with the specific gravity of a man accustomed to being the final word in a room. And it is coming from a suspended employee who has no authorization to be in this bay, touching this patient, making clinical statements to this team. Dr. Gerald Ashton stood at the threshold of the trauma bay. His arms were crossed. His face was controlled in the way faces are controlled when the person behind them has practiced keeping it that way. Beside him stood a man Nora recognized not from the clinical floors, not from rounds or chart reviews, but from the administrative circulation of the building. Stuart Radner, Executive Director of Operations, mid-50s, heavy-set, expensive watch, the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that powerful people don't need to fill silence. Radner controlled the hospital's administrative infrastructure, including, Nora knew from 3 years of observing how the building actually ran, the credentialing access system, the digital keys that determined which physicians could enter orders under which authorizations. She thought about Warren Tilley's chart, the medication order, the specific access code attached to it. She held that thought and turned back to the table. "The suppression is reversible," she said to Fowler. "But the window is narrow. If he doesn't receive the counteragent protocol within the next 40 to 50 minutes, the neurological impact becomes unpredictable. I can walk you through the components. You're the attending of record for this patient. You have authority to proceed." Fowler said, "Without hesitation, walk me through it." Dr. Fowler. Ashton's voice tightened. "This woman is suspended. She has no clinical standing in this hospital right now. Any treatment decision made on her recommendations is my decision," Fowler said, and her voice was entirely calm. "I'm the trauma surgeon of record for this patient, from the moment that transport cleared our bay. And what this nurse is describing, if accurate, makes this a criminal matter, not an administrative one." She looked at Ashton with the clear, direct expression of someone who has decided which side of a line they're standing on. "So with respect, Dr. Ashton, I need you to step back from this bay while I manage my patient." Ashton didn't move immediately. A second passed, the specific, heavy second of a man recalculating. Then he stepped back. Nora was already moving. She called out the counteragent components in sequence specific, precise, no ambiguity, the kind of recall that only came from training that had been repeated under stress until it was automatic. Fowler confirmed each component, cross-referenced 2 of them against the hospital's restricted pharmaceutical inventory, and had the first element running within 4 minutes. Behind her, she was aware of Ashton and Radner in the doorway. She couldn't see them, she was focused on the table, but she could feel the shape of what they were doing. Ashton was on his phone. Radner had taken a step back from the threshold, a small, deliberate repositioning that told her something without telling her everything. She filed both observations and kept working. A federal agent had appeared in the bay. She registered him in her peripheral vision, badge on his jacket, recording device running, the controlled energy of someone who had been waiting for its specific development and was now watching it happen. The counteragent, worked it was supposed to work. Methodically, not dramatically. Sauer's vitals climbed in increments over 20 minutes, each one measurable. each one logged by Fowler's team. His respiratory rhythm settled. His blood pressure found a more stable baseline. The monitor's cardiac trace smoothed. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Captain Dwight Sauer opened his eyes fully, stared at the ceiling for a moment, then turned his head and found Nora's face. His voice, when it came, was rough from the airway adjunct and the suppression and whatever he'd been through. Before the transport. "How long? We're still calculating that," she says. "Don't try to move yet. Your system needs time. I know where I am." His eyes moved past her, traveled slowly across the room, and found the doorway. Found Ashton. Found Radnor. And stayed there. Not with the unfocused look of someone still clearing sedation. With the specific, deliberate focus of a man reading something. Confirming something. "Those two," he said, his voice dropping below the room's ambient sounds so only she could hear it. "The one's in the door. The taller one's a surgeon. The other one runs hospital operations." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Get the military liaison, and make sure neither of those men leaves this building." She straightened up, turned, and looked at Warrant Officer Pruitt, who had stationed himself near the wall. Pruitt looked at the federal agent. The federal agent was already reaching for his radio. Ashton, when Nora turned to face the doorway directly, had gone still in the way people go still when an exit they'd assumed was available suddenly isn't. The controlled authority was still on his face. Surgeons were good at keeping their faces, but something had shifted underneath it, a hairline fracture in the presentation. His eyes moved to Sauer, conscious and tracking, on the table, and something behind his expression changed in a way that had nothing to do with clinical concern. It looked like the specific fear of someone who had built a structure around a particular outcome and was watching that outcome fail in real time. Radnor had moved. Not visibly, he hadn't turned or walked. But he had stepped back from the doorway by another half foot, a subtle repositioning that Nora noticed and logged. Sauer's hand found her wrist. Weak grip, but intentional. "You knew the protocol," he said, quiet and direct. "Lockbridge. You knew it. I was attached to a unit that developed the response sequence." "Which unit?" she told him. One name spoken low. He exhaled. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but the particular release of a man who had spent time not knowing who he could trust and had just resolved one piece of that question. "Then you know what I was carrying when they hit the convoy." She did. She didn't say so out loud. But the federal agent, 3 feet away, had heard enough, and his expression said he had too. Down the hall, beyond the trauma bay door, a sound, a door opening, then closing. Quick, deliberate, the sound of a decision being made. Nora didn't turn around. She noted the wall clock, 2:51 p.m. She held that number the way she'd been trained to hold small, specific details in the field, the ones that seemed inconsequential until they became the thread that everything else unraveled from. She had walked out of this building at 11:37 that morning, with her badge on the desk, and no idea what the afternoon held. She had walked back in at 2:19. In the space of 32 minutes, she had identified a chemical agent that the trauma team hadn't recognized, reversed a suppression protocol that nobody else in the building had the training to address, and brought a witness back to consciousness that someone had gone to significant effort to keep silent. And now Captain Dwight Sauer was awake on that table, looking at the doorway where 2 men had just been standing. One of them was still there. One of them was gone. The federal agent was already moving toward the hallway, radio pressed to his jaw, his voice low and clipped, calling out a description. Nora looked at Fowler. Fowler looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Fowler said quietly, "I'm going to need your full statement. Everything you know about that compound." "I know," Nora said, "and for what it's worth." Fowler paused, checked Sauer's monitor one more time, then looked back. "That order you flagged this morning. Tilly's chart. I pulled it 20 minutes ago." A brief silence. "You were right." Nora didn't answer. She turned back to the patient. Sauer was watching the doorway. His jaw was set. His eyes were clear. And somewhere in the corridor outside Trauma Bay, 2, a man who had believed a suspended nurse was the least of his problems was beginning to understand exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. Somewhere in the corridor outside Trauma Bay 2, a man who had believed a suspended nurse was the least of his problems was beginning to understand exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. The federal agent who moved into the hallway first was named Corbin Vass. Nora learned that in the next 4 minutes, when he came back through the Trauma Bay door and introduced himself with the specific economy of someone who didn't have time for full sentences. Special Agent, Department of Defense, Inspector General's Office. He had the compact, unremarkable look of someone who had spent years being the person in the room that nobody remembered until they needed to. His eyes moved fast and landed slow, the kind of eyes that were always doing more work than his face suggested. Dr. Ashton is in the east stairwell, he said, to nobody in particular, and everybody signed simultaneously. We have someone with him. He hasn't left the building. He looked at Nora. I need 5 minutes with you when you're clear. 3, she said, because Sauer's blood pressure was still climbing in increments she wanted to watch, and she wasn't stepping away from the table until it plateaued. Vass nodded and went back to his phone. Fowler was running a secondary neuroassessment, methodical and quiet, her hands steady in the way that good trauma surgeons' hands were always steady, regardless of what their brain was processing. She called out numbers to her resident, who logged them without comment. The bay had found a different rhythm than the one it had been running on 20 minutes ago, still urgent, but no longer chaotic. The difference between a team that didn't know what it was dealing with and a team that did. Sauer had his eyes on the ceiling. His jaw was working slightly, the particular jaw movement of someone running through something in their head, sorting and cataloging. His right hand was flat on the table. Now the fist released, fingers spread against the surface, like he was checking that it was real. Your name is Callahan, he said. Not a question. Nora Callahan. Yes, you were medic attached to Bravo element. Rotation 3. He said it like he was reading from a document he'd memorized years ago. Rotation 2 and 3. I rotated out before the 4th cycle. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. I was told the rotation 2 medic was male. The record was filed under my initials and my predecessor's last name. It was an administrative error nobody bothered to fix. She paused. It happens. He made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't not one either. Yeah, he said. It happens. Cost pressure plateaued at a number she could work with. She stepped back from the table and looked at Vass, who had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone filling in a map. 3 minutes, she said. They moved to the corner of the bay, far enough from the table to drop their voices, close enough that she could still see the monitor. Vass pulled out a small notebook, actual paper, which she noted and held a pen over it, without writing anything yet. How do you know the Lockbridge Protocol? He asked. Straight in, no preamble. I was attached to the unit that developed the neuro-response sequence during my second forward rotation. It was a classified research application using specific verbal stimuli keyed to conditioning responses in operatives who might be compromised or captured and rendered non-responsive. The protocol was designed to penetrate chemical or trauma-induced suppression from a trusted source. What's the classification level on that program? Was. Past tense. The program was suspended after the 3rd trial cycle. She met his eyes. I don't know the current classification. That's not a deflection. I genuinely don't know what's been done with it since I rotated out. He wrote something. The compound in Sauer's field record. You recognized it on site. I recognized the designation. I've seen it used once in a controlled context during the research phase. It's not something that ended up in any civilian pharmacopoeia I'm aware of. The fact that it was in his pre-hospital record means someone with access to restricted military pharmaceutical channels administered it before his extraction, is poor or altered the field record after the fact to make it look like it was administered earlier than it was. Why would someone do that? She looked at him for a moment. Because Captain Sauer was carrying something. And whoever wanted to make sure he couldn't deliver it needed him incapacitated without it being obvious why. Vass stopped writing. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has just heard a person arrive independently at a conclusion that matched his own. What do you know about what he was carrying? Nothing specific, she said. But I know the unit he was attached to, and I know the kind of operational work they were doing during the period I was forward deployed. If a transport came in with that level of protective infrastructure, she nodded toward the window, the dark vehicles still visible in the bay, and with a compound like that in his system, then whatever he had was testimony grade. Something that required him to be breathing and coherent to be useful. Vass closed the notebook. Ms. Callahan, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer it the same way. Okay. Is there any possibility you were targeted this morning? The suspension. The medication order conflict. Is there any possibility that was deliberate, designed to remove you from this building before the transport arrived? The question sat in the air between them for a moment. She had asked herself the same thing in the car, outside the diner, half-formed, pushed aside because it felt like the kind of paranoid leap that happened when you were angry and looking for patterns. Now standing in the trauma bay with a chemically suppressed special operations officer recovering 6 feet away, with a surgeon who had fled into a stairwell, with a hospital operations executive who had been standing in that doorway, and was now she looked toward the bay entrance, apparently no longer in the building at all. The question didn't feel like a paranoid leap anymore. I think, she said carefully, that the timing is worth examining. Vass nodded once. So do we. The next hour moved the way. Hours moved in crisis, simultaneously too fast and granular enough that each minute left a distinct mark. Vass and his team worked the building's administrative infrastructure with the focused efficiency of people who had prepared for exactly this scenario. Warrant Officer Pruitt coordinated the military elements, which included 2 additional personnel who materialized from what felt like nowhere and were clearly not standard Army liaison staff. Fowler kept working the patient, called in a specialist consult, and communicated with the ICU team about a transfer that would happen once Sauer was stable enough to move without risk. Nora sat in the family consultation room, adjacent to the bay, and gave her full statement to a Sextant agent named Marcy Holt, younger than Vass, more precise in her questioning, the kind of meticulous interviewer who asked the same thing 3 different ways to see if the answers matched. They matched. Nora had a specific detailed memory trained by years of needing to file accurate field reports under conditions where accuracy was the difference between a debriefing and a disaster. She told Holt everything. The morning, the medication order, the lab values, the sequence of escalation, the suspension, the phone call from Pruitt, her recognition of the compound in the field record, the Lockbridge response, what Sauer had said in the moments after he came around. Holt wrote it all down without expression, which Nora respected. At the end, Holt set her pen down and said, "The medication order that got you suspended this morning, the heparin order for Warren Tilley. What was the physician access code attached to it?" Nora told her. She'd memorized it from the chart, the way she memorized numbers that seemed wrong before she understood why they were wrong. Holt looked at it. Something shifted in her expression, the first flicker of something other than professional neutrality. "Where did you see that code before?" she asked. "On the discharge order. It was listed as Dr. Ashton's authorization. And who controls the issuance of physician access codes at this hospital?" Nora looked at her. "The executive director of operations." Holt picked up her pen again and underlined something in her notes. She didn't say anything else for a moment. "Then Mr. Radnor was not in the building when our team secured the perimeter." He left through the parking structure on the north side approximately 7 minutes after Captain Sauer regained consciousness. A pause. We're locating him. The family consultation room felt very small after that. Ashton had been walked to a hospital administrative conference room on the second floor by 2 of Vass's people, and Vass went in alone to talk to him. Nora wasn't in the room. She wasn't supposed to be. But Pruitt found her in the hallway 20 minutes later and told her, with the flat delivery of someone reporting a weather condition, that Ashton had lawyered up within 4 minutes and then unlawyered up 11 minutes after that and started talking. What changed? She asked. Vass showed him the access code on Tilly's order, showed him the timestamp and the authentication trail. Pruitt paused. Ashton says he didn't write that order. Says his access code was used without his knowledge. She processed that. Is he telling the truth? Vass thinks so. The authentication trail has some irregularities that are consistent with credential spoofing. Someone used Ashton's code to enter that order, but the login origin doesn't match his usual device or location. Another pause, which means someone with administrative access to the credentialing system generated a login under Ashton's credential to put a dangerous order in a patient's chart. On the same morning, a military transport carrying a federal witness was due to arrive at this facility. She leaned against the corridor wall. The linoleum under her feet was the standard institutional gray that hospital floors always were, scuffed at the edges, too bright in the fluorescent light. She looked at it for a moment. They didn't just want Sauer incapacitated, she said. They wanted the person most to recognize what had been done to him out of the building, first. Pruitt said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. How did they know I would be the one to recognize it? We're working on that. She pushed off the wall. I want to talk to Sauer. He's being transferred to the ICU in about. Before the transfer, Pruitt looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression of someone doing a rapid calculation of costs and benefits. Then he turned and walked toward the trauma bay, and she followed. The bay was quieter now. 2 nurses she didn't know were running the transfer, prep IV management, monitor leads, the careful choreography of moving a patient who was stable, but not stable enough to be careless with. Fowler was at the wall station writing notes. She looked up when Nora came in and didn't object to her presence, which was its own kind of statement. Sauer was propped at a slight angle now, the head of the table elevated enough that he could see the room. He looked better than he had. Still gray around the edges, still moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was not yet fully cooperating. But his eyes were sharp, and his jaw was set, and he looked like himself, or like what herself meant, for a man she'd known only through field designations and a single operational cycle 7 years ago. She pulled a chair to the side of the table and sat. Radnor is gone, she said quietly. He left the building before the perimeter was set. They're looking for him. Sauer absorbed this without visible reaction. How much time did he have? 7 minutes from when you woke up. He made a short sound. 7 minutes is enough if you know where you're going. Did he know you'd be brought here, specifically? Someone did. The convoy route was filed with 3 possible destination hospitals. Ardmore was the secondary option. Primary was Halverson General, 20 miles north. His jaw tightened. Someone with access to the routing file redirected us. Who has access to military transport routing files? At the level this operation was running, he looked at her steadily. More people than there should be. That's the problem. That's been the problem from the start. He shifted slightly against the table, winced, steadied. What I was carrying, what's in the evidence package, it's not just procurement fraud. It's a network. 8 contractors, 3 military acquisition officers, 2 civilian oversight administrators. The documentation covers 6 years of falsified safety certifications on field equipment. Body armor, vehicle armor, communication systems. He stopped. Soldiers died using that equipment, not because of combat, because the materials didn't perform to specification, and the certification records were altered to say they did. The bay was quiet enough that she could hear the monitor's steady tone. Families of those soldiers, he continued, were told their deaths were combat-related, standard field risk. Nobody looked at the equipment failure rate because the paperwork said the equipment was fine. His voice was level, but had something underneath it that was neither level nor fine. I've been building that case for 14 months. Physical evidence drives, contracts, internal communications. It's in a location only 2 people know. I'm one of them. Who's the other? A federal prosecutor named Willa Strand, DOJ. She's been working the legal framework in parallel. He paused. She should have been notified the moment this transport was rerouted. If she hasn't been, I'll tell Vass. Tell him now. Not in an hour now. She stood up. His hand came out and caught her wrist again, the same grip as before, weak but precise, the grip of someone who needed to say one more thing before the moment closed. The word you used, he said. Lockbridge. The protocol. You knew it without hesitating. Yes, a lot of people would have hesitated. Would have thought about what it meant to use classified knowledge in a civilian hospital in front of a federal agent with a recording device. She looked at him. I thought about it. And? You were dying, she said. So I used it. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he released her wrist and settled back against the table. Go tell Vass about Strand, he said. And Callahan, he waited until she looked back. Thank you for not hesitating. She left without answering that, because the transfer team was moving and the window was closing, and she had a name to deliver. Vass was in the second-floor conference room with 2 of his people and a laptop that had more windows open on it than she could track in a single glance. She gave him Willa Strand's name. He was on his phone before she'd finished the sentence, stepping into the corner of the room with his back to the door. She sat in one of the conference room chairs and felt, for the first time since 11:37 that morning, the particular variety of exhaustion that came not from physical exertion, but from operating at sustained high intensity in a situation that kept reclassifying itself. Her coffee from the diner was 10 hours ago in a different world. Her badge was on the 4th-floor nursing station desk. Her suspension was still technically in effect. Had Ted said otherwise, and she wasn't naive enough to assume that the events of the afternoon had automatically resolved the morning. One of Vass's people, a woman named Torres, who had the quiet, watchful energy of someone who had been in this work long enough to stop being surprised by anything, set a bottle of water on the table in front of Nora without being asked. You doing okay? Torres asked. I'm fine. Torres looked at her with the expression of someone who knew the difference between fine and fine. There's food in the break room down the hall. Real food, not vending machine. When this slows down enough for you to eat something, you should. Okay, I mean it. Not just saying it. Nora looked at her. I know. Torres nodded and went back to her station. Nora drank half the water. Vass came back from the corner. His face had shifted in a way she was learning to read, not alarmed, but recalibrated. The expression of someone who had just received information that changed the shape of the next several hours. He sat across from her and put his phone face down on the table. Strand has been notified. She's been in a secure location since yesterday. She had a security concern flagged at her office 2 days ago that prompted a precautionary relocation. He paused. Which means someone in this network knew the prosecution was further along than they'd assumed. So they moved on sour before he could deliver the evidence. That's our read. He drummed his fingers once on the table. Here's where we are. We have Ashton in custody cooperative, credentialing fraud that he may or may not have been aware of. We're still working that. We have Radner in the wind. We have a witness who is alive because of you, but who is not yet stable enough to give a formal deposition. And we have an evidence package in an undisclosed location that only Sauer and Strand know the coordinates of. Can Sauer give you the location? He can. He hasn't yet. He wants Strand present when he does. That's not unreasonable. No, Vass agreed. It's not. It's also going to take until tomorrow at the earliest to coordinate, given Strand's current situation. He looked at her directly. In the meantime, we have a problem. Radner has a 7-minute head start and resources we're still mapping. And Ashton, during the portion of our conversation where he was talking, mentioned something I need you to help me understand. What did he say? Vass leaned forward slightly. He said that the credentialing accessed the spoofed login that put the medication order in Tilly's chart wasn't Radner acting alone. He said there was a second layer of authorization. Someone who controlled access above Radner's level. He paused. Someone who isn't employed by this hospital. The conference room was quiet. Down the hall, she could hear the muffled sounds of the building's ordinary operations carts moving, an intercom announcement, the distant chime of an elevator. Who? She asked. That's what we're trying to determine. Ashton says he only knows a surname, and even that he's not certain is real. Vass kept his eyes on her. He says the name he was given was Gareth. No first name. No title. Just Gareth. He paused. Does that mean anything to you? From your service record? From the unit? From anything in the operational context you were working in? She sat with it, turned it over, ran it against every name and designation she'd carried from that chapter of her life. No, she said. You're sure? I'm sure I don't recognize it. That's not the same as being sure it means nothing. Vass nodded slowly. He picked up his phone. He started to dial. And then Torres, from across the room, said his name in a flat, particular tone that made everyone in the room go still. Vass looked up. Torres was reading something on her screen. She turned it so he could see it from across the table. He read it. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something around. His eyes tightened in a way that Nora had not seen in the past several hours of a situation that had given him plenty of reasons to react. What is it? Nora asked. He turned the laptop so she could see the screen. It was a hospital security alert. Timestamp, 4 minutes ago. Location, the ICU on the 7th floor. Captain Dwight Sauer's transfer had been completed 18 minutes earlier. The alert said that someone had accessed the ICU-restricted corridor using a valid staff credential at 6:03 p.m. The credential belonged to a nurse who had been off shift since 2 in the afternoon and had not badged back into the building. And the security camera covering the ICU corridor entrance, the only camera with a direct angle on Sauer's room, had gone offline at 2 p.m., 1 minute before the badge access. Nora was already on her feet. Nora was already on her feet before Vass finished reading the alert, and she was moving toward the door before he could tell her to wait, which he did anyway. Callahan, 7th floor, ICU. How many of your people are up there right now? He was already reaching for his radio. 1. Stationed outside the unit entrance. 1 isn't enough, I know that. They moved into the hallway together, Torres falling in behind them, and the 3 of them covered the distance to the elevator bank in the kind of controlled fast walk that was 1 gear. Below, running fast enough to matter. Slow enough not to trigger the building's ambient alarm response by looking like a threat themselves. Vass was on the radio the whole way, clipped sentences that sounded like code but weren't, just the specific shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to compress language to its load-bearing elements. The elevator was wrong. Too slow, wrong floor, doors opening on 3 when they needed 7. Nora hit the stairwell door beside it and took the stairs at a pace that cost her nothing. She'd run steeper grades than this in full kit in temperatures that made a November hospital stairwell feel tropical, and she heard Torres right. Behind her and Vass a half-beat back, radio still going. 7th floor. The stairwell door opened onto a corridor that was immediately, obviously wrong. It was too quiet. ICU floors had a particular ambient sound monitors, ventilators, the low constant hum of equipment running 24 hours in rooms where the margin between stable and not was measured in minutes. That sound was there, underneath, but the surface layer of the floor, the movement, the staff presence, the ordinary visual density of an active unit was missing in a way that wasn't shift-change quiet. It was cleared quiet, the kind of quiet that happened when people had moved away from something rather than toward it. The agent Vass had stationed at the unit entrance a young man named Kellert, who had the look of someone who had been standing post for 2 hours and had just experienced a significant deviation from what he'd been told to expect, was pressed against the wall beside the unit door, with his hand on his jacket and his eyes on the corridor junction, 20 feet ahead. Report, Vass said, voice low and flat. Someone's in the unit, Kellert said. Accessed through the restricted corridor 4 minutes ago. I had the entrance covered, but the restricted corridor connects to the south wing. There's a secondary access point I wasn't told about. His jaw was tight. I heard a staff member, one of the ICU nurses. She said something, and then it went quiet. I didn't want to go in without backup because the patient is Sauer's room door closed. When I last had a visual, yes. Closed, and the light above it was green. Green meant the room's internal lock was engaged, which meant either Sauer had engaged it himself, possible if he'd been conscious and aware enough to react, or someone inside had engaged it, which was a different kind of information entirely. Vass looked at Nora. She was already reading the unit layout diagram posted beside the entrance door, the kind of laminated floor plan that every hospital unit displayed for emergency reference, and that nobody looked at until they needed it badly. She found the room designations, found Sauer's assigned room, traced the internal corridor configuration. There's a supply access between rooms 4 and 5, she said. It's not on the main diagram. It's a utility corridor for equipment transfer. If someone came in through the restricted corridor, they could reach Sauer's room without passing the main nurse station. You know this building's layout that well? I did a full unit orientation when I started here. Supply corridors are part of it. She looked at him. I can go in through the main entrance. I'm a nurse. I have a reason to be in there that nobody questions on site. You don't have a current badge. Torres, she said, without looking away from Vass. Torres was already unclipping a visitor access credential from her jacket, a secondary pass, the kind that opened standard hospital doors without logging to a specific employee record. She handed it to Nora without being asked twice. Vass looked at her for a moment. The moment was short. You go in, you assess, you don't engage. If Sauer's room is the problem, you come back out and tell me what's in there. You do not go into that room alone. Understood. She went in. The ICU unit proper was not empty. It was reduced fewer staff than a normal shift. The ones present clustered near the station, in the center of the unit, with the particular posture of people who had been told to stay where they were. One of the nurses, a heavy-set man with close-cropped hair, maybe 45, looked at Nora when she came through the door, with the specific look of someone who wanted to say something and was deciding whether they were allowed. She moved toward him, slow and deliberate, because running in an ICU was wrong on too many levels to calculate. The restricted corridor, she said quietly. How long ago? He glanced toward the south wing access point. Maybe 6 minutes. I didn't see who it... I heard the badge access, and by the time I turned around, whoever it was had already cleared the corner. His voice was low and tight. I tried to call security. The desk phone in that section has no dial tone. Just dead. How many staff are in the unit right now? 6, including me. We have 9 patients. Most of them are sedated. He paused. Room 7 is the military patient. His door locked from the inside about 3 minutes after we got the restricted corridor access. He looked at her steadily. That's not a standard function. The internal lock on those doors is for emergencies. The patient would have to activate it manually, or someone inside activated it, she said. He nodded. Once. The kind of nod that meant he'd already worked through the same logic and didn't enjoy where it ended. She thanked him and moved. The corridor to room 7 was straight and short, and felt considerably longer than it was. The light above the door was green internal lock engaged, exactly as Kellert had reported. She stopped outside it, put her ear close to the gap at the door's edge, and listened. Voices. Two of them. One she recognized. Sauer's voice was low and deliberate, the voice of someone managing pain and managing a situation simultaneously. The other voice was male, older, with a controlled quality that was doing a lot of work to stay controlled, the voice of someone whose plan had encountered a variable they hadn't fully accounted for. She couldn't make out words. She could make out tone, and the tone told her that the conversation inside was still. A conversation, nobody was screaming, nothing was breaking. The specific sounds of acute violence were absent. Whatever was happening in room 7 was still in the negotiation phase, which meant she had a window. She went back to the unit entrance, through the door, and reported to Vass in 30 seconds flat, 2 voices, Sauer's and one unknown male, internal lock engaged, negotiation phase still active, restricted corridor, access point, was the entry vector. Desk phones in that section were dead. Vass absorbed it in the same 30 seconds. Description on the voice? Male, older, controlled but under pressure. Not military civilian register, no field cadence. Torres said, Radner, it wasn't a question. Vass looked at her. He came back, Torres said. He left, realized he couldn't get to the evidence without knowing the location, and came back for the one person who knows it. The logic was clean and horrible. Radner had 7 minutes before the perimeter went up. He'd used them to disappear, recalculate, and determine that the evidence location died with Sauer if Sauer couldn't talk. Killing him at the hospital was a significant escalation. It was the kind of move that burned everything and everyone attached to it, but a man whose credentialing fraud had just been linked to a federal witness tampering. Operation was already past the point of clean exits. Do we have the restricted corridor covered now? Nora asked. Kellert's on it. 2 more of my people are 90 seconds out. Vass looked at the unit door. Standard protocol for a hostage situation in a medical environment is to establish perimeter, attempt communication, and wait for specialized response. He paused. Specialized response is 40 minutes out minimum. Sauer's post-suppression. His system is still clearing. 40 minutes of elevated stress response could cause. I know. I'm not being alarmist. I'm telling you the clinical reality. His cardiovascular stability is not guaranteed right now. Sustained acute stress could trigger a secondary event. Vass looked at her with the expression of a man who understood exactly what she was telling him and didn't have a good answer, Tespet, for it. What are you suggesting? Let me talk to him. To Sauer? To whoever's in that room with Sauer. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Behind Vass, Torres was very deliberately not reacting. You're a nurse, Vass said, not a negotiator. I know. But I'm also the person who walked into a trauma bay this afternoon with a suspended badge and talked a man back from a chemical suppression that your entire trauma team hadn't identified. She held his eyes. And I'm the person that Ashton targeted this morning, which means I'm the person that whoever is in that room knows has already caused them significant damage today. She let that settle. Sometimes the right person for a negotiation is the one the other person already has reason to focus on. Vass was quiet for a moment. Then you talk through the door. You do not go in. You find out if there's a weapon. You find out Sauer's current condition, and you give me whatever information you can about the person on the other side. He looked at her steadily. If the door opens and you see a weapon, you move away from it. You don't try to be something you're not. I know what I am. He nodded. Then go. She went back through the unit door, alone this time, moving at the measured pace of a nurse doing rounds, because that was the only pace that made sense in this space. And she walked the corridor to room 7 and stopped outside the door and knocked twice, not hard, not tentative. The knock of someone who expected an answer. Silence for a moment. Then who is it? The older voice, close to the door. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm one of the nurses who's been working with Captain Sauer since his transport arrived. I need to do a clinical check. His post-procedure monitoring has a time-critical window. She kept her voice level and practical, the nurse voice, the one that wasn't threatening, because it was too busy being professional. I'm not armed. I'm by myself. I just need to know he's okay. A long pause, longer than she liked. She counted it 7 seconds, 8, 9. Step back from the door, the voice said. She stepped back 2 paces. The internal lock disengaged with a click she felt more than heard. The door opened 6 inches and stayed there. The man behind it was not Stuart Radner. She knew Stuart Radner's face from the brief minutes he'd stood in the trauma bay doorway that afternoon, and the face looking at her through the 6-inch gap was not his. This man was older, mid-60s, possibly older, with the gaunt, precise look of someone who had spent a long time being very careful about very specific things. Gray suit, no tie, one hand visible on the door edge, the other not visible, which told her what she needed to know about the other hand. She had 1 second to recalibrate. She used it. "You're not Radner," she said. "No," the man said. His voice was exactly as she'd heard it through the door controlled, under pressure, doing sustained work to stay that way. "Radner is a functionary. I'm not." A pause. "You're the nurse who used the Lockbridge protocol." "Yes." That was not something we anticipated. He said it without apparent emotion, the way someone might note an unexpected weather event. The protocol was listed as decommissioned in the program records. It wasn't, evidently. His eyes moved over her face, with the particular assessment of someone who had spent a career reading people quickly and accurately. How many people are outside this unit right now? Enough that leaving isn't a realistic option for you. A sound from inside the room, Sauer's voice, low and tight, Callahan. "He has a—" "I know," she said, before Sauer could finish the sentence. She kept her eyes on the man at the door. "I know. And he knows that using it makes everything else irrelevant." She looked at the man directly. "Sir, I don't know your name. I know you've been running something for a long time that required a lot of people to believe you were not running anything. I know that somewhere in the last 6 hours, that structure came apart faster than you planned for." She paused. "I also know that Captain Sauer is in a post-suppression recovery window right now, and that his cardiovascular system is not stable. Whatever you need from him, you will not get it from a dead man. And if he crashes in that room in the next 20 minutes, and if he crashes in that because his system couldn't handle the stress load, then you've destroyed the only leverage you have." The man looked at her. His breathing was controlled, but not relaxed, the breathing of someone maintaining control through technique, rather than through calm. "What leverage do I have?" he said. It wasn't rhetorical. He was actually asking. She understood that suddenly, and clearly he was asking because he was at the edge of the calculation, the place where the options ran out, and he was looking for someone to tell him there was still a variable he'd missed. "The truth," she said, "about who put you in this position." A beat of silence. "You think someone put me in this position," he said. "I think a man named Radner used your infrastructure and your access to run a procurement fraud that you may or may not have been fully read into. I think when it started unraveling today, you were the one standing closest to it. And I think the only distinction between you and Radner right now, in terms of what happens in the next 12 hours, is whether you're the one who talks first." She was making calculated guesses, not statements of fact, and she was aware of that. But the guesses were grounded in what Ashton had said in the conference room, a name, Gareth, no first name. Someone above Radner's level who wasn't employed by the hospital, and in the way this man was standing in the doorway of an ICU room instead of having been gone, like Radner was gone. Radner had run. This man had come back. That distinction meant something. "Gareth," she said. His hand on the door edge shifted slightly. "Just slightly. That's what Ashton called you," she said. Just the one name. He wasn't sure if it was real. "It isn't," the man said, after a pause. "It's a designation. From a program that was supposed to have ended 9 years ago." Something moved through his face, not regret exactly, more like the expression of someone looking at the full distance they'd traveled from a decision they made a long time ago. I was the program administrator. After it was officially suspended, certain elements of the research were repurposed. Radner found the infrastructure and found a use for it that I didn't authorize and couldn't stop without exposing what the infrastructure was. He trapped you. He had enough documentation to implicate me regardless of my actual involvement in the fraud. If I came forward, I went down for the program itself. If I stayed quiet, I was complicit in what he built on top of it. He looked at her with the tired, precise expression of a man who had been living inside that logic for long enough that he'd stopped seeing the edges of it. There was no clean option. There's one now, she said. It's not clean, but it exists. From inside the room, Sauer said nothing. He was listening. She could feel it. The man Gareth, the designation, whatever his actual name was, stood at the door for another moment. She didn't push. She'd said what she had to say, and pushing past it would collapse the thing she'd built in the last 3 minutes. Then he opened the door fully and stepped back. The room was small in the way. ICU rooms were small equipment dense, light-controlled, the particular closeness of a space designed for sustained critical monitoring. Sauer was in the bed, upright at 45 degrees, IVs intact, monitor running beside him. His face was pale and set, and his jaw was tight from the effort of keeping his breathing even. He was looking at the man who just stepped back from the door with the expression of someone who had been held at gunpoint because he had been. The weapon, a compact, nondescript handgun, was now held at the man's side, barrel angled at the floor. Nora stepped into the room. She went directly to Sauer's monitor, checked his pressure and rate, found them elevated but not critical, and adjusted the head elevation 2 degrees because his respiratory effort was slightly labored and that 2 degrees would help. "Tell me your actual name," she said to the man behind her, without turning around. A pause. Douglas fell. She noted it. She would give it to Vass in the next 60 seconds. Mr. Fell. "The agents outside this room need to know what's happening. I'm going to open the door, step out, and tell them that you're cooperating. You're going to stay here and not move." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Can you do that?" Douglas Fell looked at the weapon in his hand as though he just remembered it was there. He set it on the windowsill beside him, with the deliberate movement of someone setting down something they'd been carrying for too long. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." She went to the door. She opened it. Vass was in the corridor closer than the unit entrance, which meant he'd moved up while she was talking, which she both appreciated and was not surprised by. His eyes went to her first, then to the room behind her, then back to her. "Fell," she said quietly. "Douglas Fell. He's cooperating. He has a weapon. It's on the windowsill. He put it down voluntarily. Sauer is stable, but his pressure is elevated, and he needs the room cleared of stress within the next few minutes, or we're looking at a secondary event." Vass processed this in real time. He turned to Torres. 2 words. Torres moved. He looked back at Nora. "You got him to put the weapon down." He was already looking for a way out. "I just told him where the door was." Vass looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, not quite surprise, not quite admiration, something more specific than either. Then he was moving, coordinating the room entry with 2 of his people, and Nora stepped aside to give them the corridor. She leaned against the wall outside room 7 and let herself breathe, for a moment actually breathe, not the controlled management of breath she'd been running on for the past 20 minutes. Her hands were steady. She noted that with a detached kind of interest, the way she noted things about her own body during and after high-pressure situations as data points rather than feelings. From inside the room, she heard Vass's voice, measured and clear, giving Fell the more formal statement of rights. She heard Fell responding, the same controlled register, the voice of a man who had made his decision and was now executing it without drama. She heard Sauer say, in a voice that was rough with effort and something that might have been relief, "Where's Callahan?" "Outside," Vass said. A pause. "Tell her his pressure's going to keep climbing if she doesn't come back in and adjust that IV rate." She pushed off the wall and went back in. Sauer was watching the door when she came through it. His monitor showed a pressure that he was right, trending upward in a way that needed attention. She went to the IV pump, made the adjustment, watched the readout for a moment. "You talked him down," Sauer said. "He talked himself down. I just stayed in the way long enough." "That's not nothing." She didn't answer that. She checked the monitor again, confirmed the trend was stabilizing, and looked at Fell, who was now seated in the chair in the corner of the room with Torres beside him, speaking in a low, steady voice about things that would take hours to fully document. Sauer followed her eyes. "He was the program administrator," he said. "I suspected it for about 6 months. Couldn't prove it without the physical evidence." "Where is it?" He looked at her. The look was long and careful and landed somewhere between trust and calculation. "The evidence package," he said. "It's in a climate-controlled storage facility on the east side of the city. Unit 114. The access code is a 12-digit sequence that Strand has the second half of." He paused. "I'm telling you because Vass needs to hear it, and I need to not repeat myself 6 times tonight because my head is not cooperating right now. I'll tell him. There's one more thing." His voice dropped. Not conspiratorial, just tired and careful and aware that what he was about to say mattered more than the volume it was delivered at. Fell isn't the top of it. He ran the program. He didn't fund the fraud. Radner didn't fund it either. Radner built the mechanism. But the contracts, the falsified certifications, the 6 years of dead soldiers attributed to combat risk when the equipment was the real cause. He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. That money went somewhere specific. And Fell knows where. Nora looked at the man in the corner. Fell had stopped talking to Torres. He was looking at Sauer with an expression that had no clean name, part resignation, part something older and more complicated than resignation. "I know where it went," Fell said, from across the room. His voice was quiet and even. "I've known for 4 years. I've been waiting for someone to ask me with enough protection around the question that the answer didn't kill both of us." Torres looked at Vass. Vass looked at his phone. He made a call, turned toward the window, and spoke 4 words into it that Nora couldn't hear. She stayed by the monitor. She watched Sauer's pressure curve on the readout. It was dropping now, slowly, the way a body settles when the immediate threat has passed and the autonomic system begins to believe, cautiously, that it might be allowed to recover. The room held the specific silence of a situation that had just passed through its most dangerous moment without breaking. And then Vass's phone rang. He answered it. Listened for 11 seconds. His face, when he turned around, was not the face of someone who had just received good news. "Radner," he said to the room. "He's been located." A pause. "He's in the hospital." Nora turned from the monitor. "He came back," Torres said. "He never left," Vass said. "He's been in the building since this afternoon. He used the construction access on the north subbasement. It's been unlocked for a renovation project, not on the standard security sweep." He looked at his phone. "He's in the hospital's data center. Subbasement, level 2. He looked up. He's trying to wipe the credentialing system records. If he succeeds, the authentication trail that links him to the medication order and the access spoofing disappears." Sauer said from the bed, voice tight with the effort of someone trying to sit up straighter than their body was permitting. "How long does he have to do it?" Vass looked at Torres. Torres was already on her laptop. The system purged for a full credentialing database at that server configuration. She was typing fast. If he has direct physical access to the terminal, he can initiate a secure wipe in under 8 minutes. "We have no way to lock him out remotely because the data center's network access is air-gapped from the hospital's main system." "When was he found?" Torres checked the time. 3 minutes ago. 5 minutes. Maybe less. Vass was moving. "I need the subbasement access point, and I need it in the next 30 seconds. Nora said, "I know where it is." He looked at her. The subbasement utility corridor connects to the North Service elevator. I've done supply runs down there. I know the layout. She held his gaze. 5 minutes, maybe less, before those records are gone. Vass was already at the door. Then show me. She looked at Sauer once. His monitor was stable. Torres was in the room. Fell was in the chair. She went. The hallway outside the ICU opened onto the main corridor, and they moved fast, no pretense now, no measured pace, Vass ahead. 2 of his people flanking, Nora running the internal map in her head. North wing, surface elevator, sub-basement, the access corridor she'd walked twice with supply carts and never expected to need to run. Service. Elevator was at the end of the north corridor, behind a door marked staff only in letters that had been faded by years of people not quite reading them. She hit the button. The elevator was already on 7. It opened immediately, old and slow, the kind of freight elevator that took 40 seconds to travel 2 floors. 40 seconds felt like a dimension she was moving through rather than a duration she was experiencing. Subbasement 2. The doors opened onto a corridor that was different from the hospital's upper floors. The way basements were always different: lower ceiling, exposed conduit, the smell of concrete and recycled air, fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency you felt in your back teeth. The data center was at the far end, behind a reinforced door with a keypad entry that was, as Torres had indicated, physically isolated from the main network. The door was open. Not just unlocked, open, propped with a rubber wedge, the kind of detail that meant someone had planned for needing to move quickly in and out. Vass held up a hand. They stopped. He listened for 3 seconds. Then he went in, and Nora was a half step behind him before he'd made it clear she shouldn't be. And she registered that she'd crossed a line she'd been told not to cross, and kept moving anyway, because 5 minutes was now closer to 2, and the door was open, and she knew this floor. The data center was a long, narrow room of server racks and blinking indicators, and the constant white noise roar of cooling systems. At the far end, at a workstation terminal that sat apart from the racks, a man was typing. Radner. He was typing fast, not panicked, the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan they'd prepared for. The terminal screen showed a progress indicator, a percentage. The number read 61. Vass said Stuart Radner. Federal agents. Step away from the terminal. Radner didn't step away. His hands kept moving. The number read 64. One of Vass's people moved fast along the right side of the room. Radner's elbow came back and hit something on the workstation edge. A small device, external, plugged into the terminal's secondary port. He grabbed it and shoved it into his jacket pocket and finally stepped back from the keyboard with his hands raised. 67. Torres's voice came through Vass's radio. The purge has a failsafe interrupt. If you can get me physical access to the terminal in the next 90 seconds, I can halt it. Vass looked at Nora. She was already moving to the workstation because she was the only person in the room who hadn't drawn a weapon and wasn't restraining a man. And Torres's voice came through the radio with a sequence of commands, and Nora's hands found the keyboard, and she typed what she was told to type, exactly as she was told to type it, without hesitation. The progress indicator stopped at 71. The screen changed. A system prompt appeared, red text on dark background, purge halted administrative override. 29% of the credentialing records were gone. 71% remained. From across the room, Radner, with his hands behind his back and Vass's people on either side of him, looked at the screen. Then he looked at Nora. His expression had the particular quality of a man who had spent a long time being the person in the room with the most control over outcomes, and who was now, for possibly the first time in years, entirely without it. "You have no idea," he said, with the flat, precise voice of someone delivering a statement they'd prepared, "how many people are protected by what was on that server?" 71% of it is still there, she said. "So we'll find out." He said nothing else. Vass's people walked him toward the door. As he passed the workstation, Nora looked at the terminal screen, at the 71% that remained, and at the system log scrolling below, the override prompt, timestamps, access codes, authentication trails, the digital skeleton of everything that had been built and hidden inside Ardmore Regional's credentialing infrastructure. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she noticed something in the log that hadn't been there when she'd sat down at the terminal. A second purge command. Queued. Scheduled. Set to execute automatically in 4 hours, tied not to the workstation terminal, but to a remote authorization that had been entered before Radner ever came through the subbasement door. She looked at it and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent the last 8 hours moving from one bad situation to a worse one, that stopping Radner had not stopped all of it. Someone else had set the second purge, someone who wasn't in this room, someone who had planned for Radner to fail. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she said, "Vass," and something in the way she said, it made him stop walking and turn around. She pointed at the screen. Not at the 71% recovery number, not at the halted purge indicator. At the queued command below it, nested in the system log, in a font size that assumed nobody would read that far down. He crossed the room in 4 steps and read it. His jaw tightened. He looked at Torres through the radio. "We have a secondary purge command queued on the credentialing server. Remote authorization, not local. Timestamp shows it was entered before Radner accessed the terminal. Tonight it was already in the system." A pause while Torres responded. "How long to trace the authorization origin?" He listened. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Do it now." He looked at Radner, who was standing near the door with his hands secured and his face arranged in the particular neutrality of someone who had decided that everything he said from this point forward was a legal calculation. "The second command," Vass said. "Who entered it?" Radner looked at the floor, said nothing. "It was already in the system before you came down here tonight. You knew it was there." Vass's voice was entirely level, which somehow made it carry more weight than if it hadn't been. "Which means you came down here to execute the first purge and planned to let the second one run automatically as a backup. Someone set it up for you, or you set it up for someone else. Either way, it wasn't you working alone." Radner said to the floor, "I'd like to speak with an attorney." Vass nodded at his people. They walked Radner out. The data center was quieter without him in it. The server racks ran their constant background hum, indifferent to everything. Nora was still at the terminal, looking at the queued command's entry timestamp 9:47 that morning and thinking about what she'd been doing at 9:47 that morning. Standing in a hallway outside the attending physician's lounge, presenting a lab value discrepancy to a man who didn't want to hear it. The second purge had been entered into the system 2 hours before she'd been suspended, before Sauer's transport had been rerouted to Ardmore, before any of this had been visible from the outside as the thing it actually was. Someone had known at 9:47 in the morning that this day was going to end in a data center with a federal investigation and a credentialing server that needed to disappear. Someone had planned backward from that outcome, she said. The second command wasn't contingency planning. Vass looked at her. Contingency planning is reactive. You set a backup when the primary fails. But this was entered before the transport arrived, before Radner was even in the building tonight, before there was any visible sign that anything had gone wrong. She kept her eyes on the timestamp. Whoever entered it knew this afternoon was going to go sideways. They knew before it happened. Vass was quiet for 3 seconds, which means they had access to information about the investigation timeline that Radner didn't have, or that Fell didn't have, she said. That landed. He reached for his radio. Torres had the authorization trace, running within 8 minutes, which was fast enough that she mentioned it once, and then didn't mention it again because the result required all available attention. The remote command had been entered through a VPN relay that bounced through 3 external nodes before it hit the hospital's credentialing server, not the work of a hospital administrator, not the work of a procurement fraudster who'd built a mechanism and learned to use it. This was the work of someone who understood network architecture the way specialists understood it, which narrowed the field considerably and widened the implication in a direction nobody in the room was happy about. The relay chain terminated at an IP address registered to a private consulting firm. The firm's name, Veris Strategic Solutions, produced exactly 0 results in the standard business registries, which was itself a result of a specific kind. Vass looked at the name on his phone screen a moment. Then he made a call that lasted 90 seconds, during which he said almost nothing and listened almost entirely. And when he ended it, his face had the expression of a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected and found the confirmation unsatisfying in the way that being right about something bad was always as unsatisfying. Veris was a DoD contractor, he said, past tense. Their contract was terminated 18 months ago following an internal review. The review was classified. The firm officially dissolved 8 months ago. He paused. 2 of their principals had prior affiliations with the research program that Fell administered. The room processed that. So Fell's program, Nora said slowly, didn't just get repurposed by Radner for the procurement fraud. The infrastructure got absorbed into a private contracting structure after the program was suspended. That's the shape of it, which means Gareth wasn't running one thing. He was running a transition, moving the program's assets, access, credentials, research data, network architecture into private hands before the official shutdown closed it. Vass looked at her steadily. Is going to need to answer some questions that are considerably more significant than what we've been asking him. She thought about Fell in the ICU room, the way he'd said there was no clean option, the exhausted precision of a man who'd been living inside a logic he could no longer see the edge of. She thought about the moment he'd set the weapon on the windowsill. That hadn't been the gesture of a man surrendering to something external. That had been the gesture of a man who'd been waiting for permission to stop. He'll talk, she said. He wanted to talk before tonight. He just needed the situation to make it survivable. Let's hope so, Vass said, and it was the first thing he'd said all evening that sounded less like a statement and more like an actual hope. They came back upstairs at 9:22. The hospital had a different texture at this hour, the daytime institutional density, replaced by the quieter, more skeletal night shift rhythm. Fewer people in the corridors. The overhead lights dimmed in the sections that didn't need full illumination. The ICU on 7 was still running with the reduced staff, 2 of Vass's people stationed in the corridor now. Instead of 1, the door to room 7 closed and monitored. Fell had been moved to a secure interview room on the administrative floor by the time they reached 7 standard procedure once a witness had been formally processed, Torres told her. He had asked through the agent accompanying him for 30 minutes before continuing the interview. The request had been granted, whether that was standard procedure or a judgment call on Torres's part, Nora didn't ask. Sauer was still in room 7. She knocked, got a response, and went in. He looked worse than he had an hour ago, which was not entirely surprising, given the sequence of events his recovery had been interrupted by. His color was poor, and his eyes were tired in a way that went past physical fatigue into the specific exhaustion of sustained vigilance. He had the look of a man who had not fully relaxed his guard yet, and wasn't going to until he received specific information that made it safe to. Radner, he said, in custody. Vass's people have him. She checked the monitor. His pressure was elevated, but tolerable high side of a range she'd rather it wasn't in, but not the red flag territory she'd been watching for. There's a second layer, someone above Radner and Fell, a private consulting firm with prior DoD ties. They set a backup data purge in the hospital system before the transport even arrived today. He was quiet for a moment. Veris. She looked at him. I know the name, he said. It's in the evidence package. The contracts that were falsified, 3 of them, have Veris principals as signatory witnesses. I didn't have enough to establish their operational role, just the signature connection. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. If they've been running the back-end architecture this whole time, that changes the scope of the prosecution significantly. Strand needs to know. Strand already knows more than I do about Veris. She's been building parallel documentation for 6 months. He shifted against the pillow, winced, settled. The evidence package at the storage unit, the Veris materials, are in the secondary folder. Red label. Strand has the access sequence for it. A pause. She needs to be here, not on a secure line. Here. I'll tell Vass. She started for the door. He said, Callahan. She stopped. The medication order this morning, he said. Tilly. The patient they put the wrong order in. Is he okay? She looked at him for a moment. It was a question she hadn't thought to follow up on in the chaos of the afternoon, which told her something about the day she'd had, because under normal circumstances, it would have been the first thing she tracked after leaving the hospital. I don't know, she said. I'll find out. She went to the nursing station and asked. The night charge nurse, a woman named Val, who had a pragmatic efficiency that Nora recognized and respected, pulled the file and confirmed. Tilly had been discharged that afternoon. The medication order had been intercepted and revised by Dr. Fowler. After Fowler pulled the chart during the afternoon's events, and he had left the building at 4:30 with corrected documentation and no adverse event. Fowler revised the order herself, Nora asked. Flagged it the moment she had a free hand, Val said. She also filed a formal incident report naming the original order as a clinical safety failure and citing your nursing notation as the accurate clinical assessment. A pause. It's time-stamped. It's in the system. It names you specifically. Nora stood at the nursing station for a moment with that information. It was a small thing in the architecture of the day. It was also not a small thing. Thanks, she said, and meant it in ways she didn't elaborate on. Willa Strand arrived at Ardmore Regional at 11:04 that night in a car that was not her own, with 2 DOJ security personnel and a document case that she kept physically attached to herself, with the focused attention of someone who had learned not to set things down. She was younger than Nora had expected from Sauer's description, early 40s, close-cropped, natural hair, the particular directness of a person who had spent years operating in environments where indirectness was a liability. She went straight to the administrative conference room, where Vass had set up what had evolved over the course of the evening from a field response operation into something with considerably more infrastructure, laptops, secure communication lines, a whiteboard that Torres had been adding to all night in handwriting that was illegible to everyone, except apparently Torres. Strand looked at the whiteboard, looked at Vass, and said, how much of the credentialing record survived? 71%, Vass said. The remaining 29 is gone. But we have physical evidence that supplements the digital record, Sauer's package, and whatever you brought. What I brought covers the Veris connection in detail. Signatures, financial flows, the communication chain between Veris principals and the procurement officials. She set the document case on the table. The 29% gap, what period does it cover? Torres checked. The access logs from the 18 months following the Veris contract termination. The window when the infrastructure was being transitioned. Strand nodded once, like she'd expected it. That's the period I have covered in the physical record. They knew which logs to delete because they knew what existed in parallel documentation. She looked at Vass. This was orchestrated by someone who understood the full scope of the investigation. Someone with access to investigative timelines. The room got very still. Nora, who had been standing near the door, said the second purge command was entered at 9:47 this morning, before the transport was rerouted. For anyone outside of a very specific circle, knew Sauer's coming to Ardmore. Strand looked at her. Who are you? Vass said, the nurse who kept your witness alive this afternoon. Strand looked at her for another moment. Then she opened the document case. 9:47. The transport rerouting decision was made at 9:31. She pulled a printed communications log from the case and ran her finger down it. The rerouting was communicated through an encrypted channel to 3 recipients. The second purge command was entered 16 minutes later. She looked up. 16 minutes is enough time to receive the information, process the implication, and enter a remote command. It's not enough time to do much else. Meaning whoever entered it was monitoring the rerouting communications in real time, Vass said. Meaning whoever entered it was one of the 3 recipients. Torres said, from across the room, we have 2 of the 3. Sauer was 1. The second was the transport coordinator at the originating base. She paused. The third recipient was listed as a DoD oversight administrator. The channel logs show the third recipient's confirmation receipt at 9:34. Matt Strand looked at the log in her hand. Then she looked at Vass, the oversight administrator on Sauer's transport file. I know that designation. It's a role that was created specifically for this operational context. It doesn't exist in standard DoD structure. Her voice was careful and precise, as the voice of someone handling something fragile. It was created by the program that Fell administered. After the official suspension, the designation was transferred to the private structure. To Varys, Vass said, to the person who ran Varys after it went private. She set the log on the table. His name is Leonard Marsh. He was a DoD acquisitions director for 11 years before he founded Varys. He resigned from his DoD role 4 months before the research program was officially suspended. A pause. The timing of that resignation has been in my notes for 8 months. I could never establish the mechanism that connected him to the fraud until now. The whiteboard behind Torres had a new name on it within 30 seconds. The next 3 hours were the kind of hours that didn't feel like hours. They felt like a single sustained event with texture, but no clear divisions. The kind of time that only revealed its internal structure in retrospect. Vass coordinated with DOJ and DoD simultaneously, which required a level of interagency navigation that produced, at several points, conversations that Nora could hear from across the room without being able to fully parse them, like listening to a language she almost spoke. Torres worked the digital trail on Marsh with the methodical focus of the someone who had been trained to find things that other people's training had been applied to hiding. Strand worked the document case, pulling physical records with the specific efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was, because she'd organized it herself. Nora sat in a chair near the door and was, for the first time since 2:19 that afternoon, not immediately needed. It was a strange feeling, not unwelcome. She was tired in a way that had moved past the sharp-edged exhaustion of sustained adrenaline into something deeper and more diffuse. The full-body weight of a day that had been operating at a frequency her nervous system wasn't designed to sustain indefinitely. But strange. The specific strangeness of a person who had spent 8 hours being essential and had now been deposited in the anteroom of other people's work. She thought about calling someone. She didn't have anyone obvious to call. That fact sat with her for a moment in a way that was neither dramatic nor particularly surprising. She'd structured her life, without fully intending to, in a way that prioritized function over connection. And the result was that at 11:47 at night in a hospital conference room, after the day she'd had, the person she most wanted to talk to was probably Fowler, who was 3 floors down and almost certainly still working. She went 3 floors down. Fowler was at the physician's workstation, on 4, writing notes, with the slightly vacant focus of someone whose body was present and whose brain was on its last functional reserves. She looked up when Nora came in, looked at her for a moment, and said, "Tilly's fine." "I know. Val told me. I filed the incident report. Your notation is documented as clinically accurate. The suspension," she stopped. "I've already spoken to the CNO. Falk is aware that the morning's events have a somewhat different context than she understood at the time. What did Falk say? Fowler's expression shifted in a way that suggested Falk had said several things, some of which were in Nora's favor and some of which were in Falk's favor, and the overall balance was still being calculated. She said she'd need to review the documentation before making any formal reinstatement decisions. Of course she did. It'll happen, Fowler said. It might take a few days and a formal review process and possibly some very uncomfortable conversations in rooms I'm not invited to, but it'll happen. She paused. For what it's worth, Ashton's attorney contacted the hospital's legal department 2 hours ago. He's cooperating fully with federal investigators. Part of his cooperation includes a formal statement that the medication order placed under his credential this morning was entered without his knowledge or consent, and that the nurse who flagged it was clinically correct in her assessment and in her reporting. Nora looked at the floor, the same institutional gray as every other floor in the building. That's something, she said. It's more than something. Fowler's voice was matter-of-fact, not particularly warm, which was exactly the register Nora needed it to be. You were right this morning. You were right this afternoon. You kept a federal witness alive using training that nobody else in this building had. And you did all of that on the same day you were told to hand over your badge and leave. She looked at Nora steadily. That's not nothing. Nora thought about what Sauer had said in the ICU room. Same sentiment, different words. She seemed to be collecting them from people who weren't typically in the business of offering them. I need to get back upstairs, she said. You should eat something first. Torres said the same thing. Torres is right. She ate something, a sandwich from the break room, that was marginally better than the vending machine standard Torres had referenced hours ago, and went back to the conference room at 12:30. The room had changed while she was gone. Vass's people had cleared the near-operational energy of the earlier hours and replaced it with something more deliberate, the controlled intensity of a team that had moved from response to execution. Torres had a phone to her ear and was writing fast. Strand was at the far end of the table, with her document case open and a second agent beside her running a laptop. Vass was standing at the whiteboard, which now had significantly more on it than it had 2 hours ago. Looking at it with the expression of a man reading a map he'd been assembling from incomplete pieces and had just found the piece that clarified the overall shape. He turned when she came in. Marsh, he said. We have him. Where? Private residence, 40 minutes east of the city. He's been there since this afternoon. His phone data puts him at that location from approximately 2 p.m., a pause. He made 3 calls after 9:47 this morning. One to a number registered to a Vera subsidiary that no longer officially exists. One to Radnor's personal cell. One to a number we're still tracing. He looked at his phone. DOJ has issued the warrant. We have people moving on the residence now. The 3rd call, she said. The number you're still tracing. Working on it, Marsh knew the investigation's internal timeline well enough to enter a purge command 16 minutes after the rerouting decision. He had access to encrypted DoD communication channels that were created by Fell's program, and he made a call to an unidentified number the same morning. She stopped. Is there anyone still inside the investigation infrastructure? Not Fell, not Radnor, not a contractor, someone inside the federal structure itself. Vass looked at her with an expression that said he'd been sitting with the same question and didn't have an answer he was comfortable with. Strand, she said. Strand looked up from the document case. The parallel documentation you've been building for 8 months, who knew its scope? Within DOJ? Strand's face went through something that lasted about 2 seconds and contained a considerable amount of information. My direct supervisor, 2 senior attorneys on the case team, the secure filing system administrator. She paused. That's the complete list of people with full visibility into the documentation scope. And the secure filing system is accessible to DoD oversight administrators. Under the channel structure that Fell's program created, Strand went very still. Torres, across the room, said quietly, "The third call Marsh made this morning. I have the trace." She looked at her screen. It's a DOJ internal line. It connects to the Secure Case Management System Administrator's office. The room absorbed that. Strand closed the document case and kept her hand flat on top of it. Her face was controlled in the way that faces were controlled when the person behind them was processing something that required all available capacity and couldn't spare any for expression. "His name is Walt Gruber," she said. "He's been the secure filing administrator for 6 years." A pause that had weight to it. He had full access to the documentation inventory. He would have known exactly what existed, what period it covered, and what needed to be deleted to create the maximum gap in the evidentiary record. Vass was already on the phone. Nora stood in the middle of the room and felt the day's accumulation settle around her like a structure that had been building from the moment she'd flagged a medication order at 8:42 in the morning. Each piece connecting to the next, each action generating a consequence that she couldn't have predicted from the position she'd been standing in when she took it. A suspended nurse in a hospital parking lot, drinking diner coffee and staring at the rearview mirror, had no way to see that the thread she'd pulled on was attached to 6 years of falsified safety certifications and dead soldiers and a network that stretched from a hospital credentialing system to a DOD, programmed to a private contractor to a DOJ administrator. She'd pulled it anyway, because the medication order was wrong, and wrong was something she couldn't leave alone. Vass ended his call. He looked at the room. Gruber's office is being secured now. His system access has been suspended. He looked at Strand. "Is there anything in your physical documentation that Gruber's server access wouldn't have reached?" "Yes," Strand said. "The Veris financial flow records. I kept those in physical form, only never entered into the digital system. He wouldn't have known they existed. That's the piece that connects Marsh directly to the fraud funding." "Yes." Vass looked at the document case under Strand's hand. Then he looked at the whiteboard. Then he did something Nora hadn't seen him do. All evening he exhaled. Not dramatically. Just the specific exhale of a man who had been holding something together by sustained effort and had just felt the structure become self-supporting. He turned to Nora. "I need your formal statement, the complete one, from this morning through tonight. Everything in sequence." He paused. "It's going to be long." "I know." And when it's done, he stopped. "Start it again. There are going to be conversations. About your service record. About what you knew, and when you knew it, and how you knew it. Not accusatory conversations. But they need to happen." "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been operating on a suspended badge in a federal investigation scene all evening. Nobody's going to pretend that's standard. Nobody can pretend it wasn't necessary either," she said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it got close. "No," he agreed. "They can't." She sat down at the table and pulled a notepad toward her and started writing time, sequence, detail, because that was what you did when the situation required it. The same way you wrote a nursing notation when a medication order was wrong and you needed the record to speak clearly when the voices around it got loud. Outside the conference room windows, Ardmore Regional's parking structure was lit by the flat white of overnight security lighting. 2 unmarked vehicles she recognized from the afternoon sat near the entrance. A third one she hadn't seen before was pulling in slowly. She kept writing. At 1:47 in the morning, Torres's laptop produced a notification that made her look up sharply and say Vass's name in a tone that brought everyone in the room to attention. "Marsh's residence," Torres said. She turned the screen. "The team that went to secure him, they found the house empty. He left sometime in the last 2 hours. His vehicle is gone." She looked at Vass. "His personal phone went offline 43 minutes ago. Last ping was 12 miles east of the residence." Vass looked at the screen, then at Strand, then at the document case. He knew, Strand said. If Gruber was his contact inside DOJ, and Gruber knew his access was being suspended, Gruber could have warned him. Vass finished. He was already reaching for his radio. How long ago did we suspend Gruber's system access? Torres checked. 51 minutes ago. 43 minutes between the system suspension and Marsh's phone going dark. 8 minutes. 8 minutes for a warning to travel from a DOJ filing office to a man 40 minutes outside the city who had spent 11 years building the kind of exit architecture that people with specific foreknowledge built when they understood that. The structures they depended on were not permanent. Vass was on the radio, and his voice had dropped to the flat, rapid register of someone redirecting significant resources in real time. Nora kept her eyes on Torres's screen at the last known location marker, sitting 12 miles east of a house that was now empty. Marsh had run, but the document case was on the table, and Strand's hand was still on it, and 71% of the credentialing records were still on Ardmore's server, and Zauer was alive on the 7th floor, and the physical evidence in the storage unit on the east side of the city was untouched. Everything Marsh needed to destroy was still intact. Everything he needed to survive was in motion around a man who was now 12 miles from his last known position and moving. Vass turned from the radio and looked at the room. I need Sauer's storage unit access sequence. Now, we need to physically secure that evidence before Marsh can reach it. He looked at Nora. She was already on her feet, because the storage facility was on the east side of the city, and 12 miles east of Marsh's residence put his last known position in exactly the same direction. She was already on her feet, and Vass was 2 steps behind her, and the conference room emptied into the corridor with the focused momentum of people who had run out of time for deliberation. The access sequence. That was the immediate problem. Sauer had given her the storage unit number 114 East Side Climate Controlled and told her that Strand held the second half of the 12-digit code. But Strand had the first half too, somewhere in the document case. And the full sequence needed to be transmitted to the team moving on the facility before Marsh reached it, because 12 miles at highway speed in the middle of the night was 20 minutes, maybe less if he knew the route well enough to push it. Nora stopped in the corridor. Strand, the access code, do you have the first half? Strand was already opening the document case on the conference room table behind them. I have both halves. Sauer gave me his portion when we established the evidence protocol. She pulled a sealed envelope from the case interior, broke it open, read the sequence. Transmitting it now. She handed the paper to Torres, who was on a secure line before Strand had finished the sentence. Vass was coordinating the field team 3 vehicles already moving east, a 4th from the federal field office that had been staged since early evening. The storage facility's management had been notified through an emergency law enforcement contact. The facility's own security was on standby at the gate. Nora stood in the hallway and did the math she didn't want to do. Marsh's last ping had been 43 minutes ago, 12 miles from his residence. The storage facility was approximately 15 miles from his residence, in the same eastward direction. If he'd been moving continuously since the phone went dark, he was already close. If he'd stopped to ditch the phone and switch vehicles, which was what a man with 11 years of DoD acquisitions experience and the specific foresight to build a private intelligence structure would do, then the timeline became less predictable and more dangerous. Torres looked up from the phone. Field team is 7 minutes from the facility. Facility security has the gate locked. A pause. No vehicles matching Marsh's registration in the area yet. 7 minutes. Nora looked at Vass. He was reading the same math she was. He didn't say anything reassuring, which she appreciated. 7 minutes lasted. The 7 minutes lasted the way. 7 minutes lasted when you were standing in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning with a phone to your ear and nothing useful to do with your hands. Torres kept the line open to the field team and relayed updates in a steady, low voice that told you more from its tone than its content. The even register meant nothing had gone wrong yet, which was not the same as nothing going wrong. At the 4-minute mark, field team approaching the facility's access road. At 6 minutes, gate confirmed locked. Facility security in position. No unauthorized vehicles on the property. At 7 minutes and 40 seconds, field team on site. At 8 minutes, Torres exhaled. Just slightly. Just enough. They're in, she said. Unit 114. The lock is intact. Accessing now. A pause that lasted long enough to feel specific. Evidence package confirmed present. Both primary and secondary folders. Red label secondary is intact. She looked up. It's there. All of it. Vass said something under his breath that wasn't quite a word and turned toward the window. Nora leaned against the corridor wall and felt something release in her chest that had been compressed since she'd seen Marsh's last known location on Torres's screen and understood the direction he was moving. The release wasn't relief exactly. It was the specific physical sensation of a weight been suspended over a situation, being moved to a different position, not gone, but no longer directly overhead. The evidence was there. The evidence was intact. The field team had it. Everything else, Marsh, Gruber, the prosecution timeline, the cascading consequences of a network that had just lost its primary means of self-protection, was now a matter of process rather than emergency. Terrible, complex, slow-moving process that would take months and produce outcomes that couldn't be fully predicted from this corridor at 2 in the morning. But process, not crisis. Where's Marsh? She asked. Still looking, Torres said. His vehicle was found abandoned at a highway rest stop 8 miles east of the storage facility. He's on foot, or he had a secondary vehicle staged. She paused. We'll find him. I know. And she did know. Not with the blind confidence of someone who hadn't watched how these things could go wrong, but with the grounded understanding of someone who had spent the evening watching a network built on concealment get progressively exposed from every angle simultaneously. Marsh was a man who had spent years operating through infrastructure access codes, proxy systems, insulated contractors, administrative channels. Without that infrastructure, without Radner and Fell and Gruber and the credentialing architecture they'd built, he was just a man on foot, in the dark, with the evidence against him, locked inside a federal team's custody. He had nowhere left to put himself. She went back to 7. Sauer was awake. She wasn't surprised. She doubted he'd slept. The room had the particular quality of a space that had been tense for a long time and was beginning, cautiously, to release it. His color was marginally better. His monitor showed numbers that were still on the high sides of acceptable, but trending in the right direction. The evidence is secure, she said. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he closed his eyes and opened them and said, Marsh? In the wind. They'll find him. He nodded, the nod of someone who had done enough of this work to understand what in the wind meant in practical terms. Not escaped, not free, just not yet accounted for, which was a temporary condition. Fell is talking, she said. Full cooperation. He gave Strand the operational history of the transition from the program to Varys. The financial architecture, the communication channels, the timeline of how Radner was brought in. She paused. It's going to take months to prosecute, but the structure is there. It always was, he said. It just needed someone to look at it long enough. She sat in the chair beside the bed. It was 2:20 in the morning, and she had been awake for approximately 21 hours, and her body was making its opinions about this known in the persistent, inarguable way of bodies that had been patient long enough. She sat and let it be 2:20 and quiet for a moment. The soldiers, she said, the ones who died, the equipment failures. 23 confirmed, he said. His voice was even, But the evenness cost him something visible. Possibly more. The investigation will determine the full number. 23. She held that. It wasn't an abstract number from a report, it was 23 specific human beings who had deployed an equipment that someone had certified as safe, knowing it wasn't? Because the margin between honest certification and falsified certification and falsified was money, and the money had moved through a structure that had been built to make it invisible. Their families, she said, will be notified as the investigation becomes public. That's Strand's domain. She's been building the victim notification protocol in parallel. He looked at the ceiling. That was always the part that mattered most to me. Not the prosecution, the notification. The families who were told their person died in combat when the real answer was that someone had decided their life was worth less than a contract margin. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would fit inside the space it occupied. After a moment, he said, "You should sleep. You should sleep. I'm in a hospital bed with 4 agents outside my door. I'm about as safe as I'm going to get." He looked at her. "You've been running since this morning on suspended credentials in a federal investigation scene. At some point, the adrenaline cuts out and there's nothing underneath it." She knew he was right. She also knew she wasn't going to leave the building yet, not with Marsh still unlocated and the statement she owed Vass still incomplete. "When the statement's done," she said. He accepted that. When the statement's done. She stood up, checked his monitor one final time out of habit that had nothing to do with the hour, and went back to the conference room to finish what she'd started. Marsh was found at 4:51 in the morning, not far from where they'd expected, a motel 6 miles east of the abandoned vehicle, registered under a name that took Torres 11 minutes to connect to a shell identity that traced back to a Veris subsidiary. He hadn't made it far. The secondary vehicle he'd staged a rental, booked 3 weeks ago under the shell name, the specific forward planning of someone who had always maintained exit options, was parked outside the room. The room's curtains were closed, and the light was on. He surrendered without incident, which Vass told her about in 4 flat sentences. At 5:07, while she was finishing the last section of her formal statement at the conference room table. No dramatic confrontation. No final calculation. Just a man in a motel room who had run as far as his infrastructure would carry him, and found, at the end of it, that he'd run out of infrastructure. She wrote the last line of her statement, dated it, and set the pen down. The room was quiet. Torres had stepped out 20 minutes ago. Strand was in a secure communication somewhere down the hall. Through the conference room windows, the parking structure was starting to show the first gray suggestion of early light, not sunrise yet, just the slow retraction of full dark that happened in the hour before it. Vass came back in, poured himself coffee from a carafe that had been sitting long enough to be technically hostile, and sat across from her. "Gruber is in custody," he said. "He was picked up at his home at 4:15. He had a bag packed." He drank the coffee without apparent reaction to its quality. "He's been formally suspended, pending federal charges. DOJ is managing the internal implications. How deep does it go inside DOJ? Gruber appears to be the single point of contact. We're verifying, but the current assessment is that Marsh chose one person to compromise, rather than building a broader internal network, lower exposure risk, but also a single point of failure." He paused. "Which is why, when we suspended Gruber's access, the warning to Marsh came fast. He knew immediately that his one internal asset was gone." She thought about that. One person placed carefully, given access to exactly the information needed and no more. It was the same logic as the credentialing system, not a broad conspiracy, a precise one. Targeted infiltration of specific choke points. Fell designed that structure, she said. Yes, and he's explained it in considerable detail over the last 3 hours. His attorney arrived at 3 a.m. and recommended full cooperation, which Fell had already been providing. Vass set down the coffee. He's looking at significant federal charges, regardless. But his cooperation changes the shape of the prosecution in ways that are meaningful. For him, for the case, for the families of the soldiers. He looked at her steadily. Sometimes meaningful for one thing requires meaningful for another. That's not comfortable, but it's how it works. She understood that. She didn't have to like it. Your statement, he said, pulling the pages toward him. Thank you for the detail. This is going to be important documentation. The nursing notation from this morning is already in Tilly's chart, she said. Time-stamped before any of this. If anyone needs to establish that the medication order was the inciting event, mightn't. It's already been flagged as part of the evidence record. The order, the authentication trail, your notation, the suspension documentation. He looked at her. Everything you did this morning was correct. The official record is going to reflect that. She sat with that for a moment. It was what she'd known since 8:42 when she'd looked at Tilly's chart and done the calculation and arrived at a number that couldn't be argued with. Knowing you're right and having the record reflect it were different experiences, and the distance between them had been the specific weight of the entire day. What happens to Falk? She asked. She issued the suspension. She issued a suspension based on information provided by Ashton, whose credential was being used without his knowledge in a system controlled by Radner, who was operating under instructions from Marsh. Vass paused. Whether she was aware of the broader context is being examined. Current assessment is administrative failure rather than criminal involvement. But the formal review will determine that. He looked at her carefully. Your reinstatement is not contingent on that review. It's a separate process. Given what's been documented, I don't anticipate it taking long. She nodded. She didn't ask for a timeline, because timelines in situations like this were promises that nobody was in a position to keep, and she'd rather have the honest uncertainty than a comfortable estimate. She left the hospital at 6:44 in the morning. Not because she'd been told to, and not because there was nothing left to do. There would be things to do for weeks, statements to supplement, documentation to support, testimony to prepare. But because the immediate crisis was resolved, the evidence was secured, the principals were in custody or being processed, and she had been awake for approximately 28 hours, and her body had moved from making its opinions known to issuing something closer to a formal complaint. The morning outside was cold and damp, the sky the specific gray-white of early autumn overcast that couldn't decide whether it wanted to commit to rain. She stood at the side entrance for a moment, the same entrance she'd walked out of at 11:37 the previous morning, and breathed the outside air, which smelled like wet concrete and exhaust, and the faint cold sweetness of whatever was growing in the hospital's neglected landscaping beds. She drove home, showered, slept for 5 hours in the particular deadweight way that her body defaulted to when it had been running on reserves long enough that actual rest became the only acceptable outcome. She woke at 1 in the afternoon to 4 missed calls, one from Vass, one from Fowler, one from a number she didn't recognize with a DOJ area code, and one from her mother in Phoenix, who had no knowledge of anything that had happened in the last 24 hours based on the voicemail, and had called to ask about Thanksgiving plans. She called her mother back first, because priorities were priorities. And the conversation lasted 12 minutes and covered Thanksgiving logistics and her mother's neighbor's new dog, and a recipe dispute that had, apparently, been ongoing for 3 years. It was the most normal 12 minutes she'd experienced in a significant stretch of time, and she let it be exactly what it was. The formal reinstatement came 9 days later. Not dramatically. There was no ceremony, no public moment, no satisfying single instant where a door opened and light came through it. There was a meeting in a hospital conference room with Deborah Falk and the hospital's legal counsel and a human resources representative, and a letter that had been drafted and reviewed and revised and was now, in its final form, a document stating that the suspension issued on the morning of the incident had been determined following review to be unwarranted, and that Nora Callahan was reinstated to her position with full back pay for the period of suspension, and a formal notation in her personnel file that the suspension was expunged from her record. Falk delivered this with the careful, measured professionalism of a woman who had been in enough administrative situations to know how to present a reversal without making it look like a reversal. She said the words correctly. She was not warm about it. Nora didn't need her to be warm about it. What she needed was the letter, and she had the letter. She went back to the 4th floor that afternoon and did her rounds, and the nurses she'd worked alongside for 3 years treated her with the particular normalcy of people who were very deliberately not making a thing of something, which was its own kind of welcome. Pat Mercino said at the nurses' station, without preamble and without looking up from her chart, Tilly sent a card. She slid it across the counter. It's addressed to you specifically. The card was a standard Get Well card that Warren Tilly had apparently repurposed as a thank you card, crossing out Get Well Soon with a single line and writing thank you underneath it, in the careful handwriting of a 63-year-old man who had probably been told his whole life to slow down and write more neatly. Inside, he'd written 4 lines. He was home. He was well. His daughter had visited from Seattle. And he wanted the nurse who'd caught the error to know that he knew, and that he was grateful. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her jacket pocket. Ashton's medical license was suspended by the state medical board 6 weeks after the incident, pending the outcome of the federal proceedings. The suspension wasn't punitive. The board's language was careful to note that Ashton's credential had been compromised without his full knowledge, but the events of the investigation had exposed a pattern of administrative practices that the board determined required formal review before reinstatement could be considered. He was cooperating with federal investigators, and the cooperation was substantive enough that prosecutors indicated it would be considered in sentencing deliberations. Radner was indicted on 11 federal counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, criminal endangerment, credentialing fraud, and 6 additional charges related to the procurement scheme that the evidence package made fully prosecutable. His attorney negotiated for weeks and produced nothing that meaningfully reduced the exposure. The indictment stood. Fell pleaded guilty to a reduced set of charges in exchange for full cooperation. The cooperation was, by every account that reached Nora through Vass's occasional updates, extensive and specific. He spent a long time in a series of rooms answering questions from a series of people, and the answers added material to an investigation that was, by the time it became publicly visible 3 months after the incident, significantly larger than anything the original Ardmore situation had suggested. Gruber was charged separately. His case moved through the DOJ's internal disciplinary process in addition to the federal criminal proceedings, which produced the particular slow-motion institutional accounting that such processes produced. It was unsatisfying to watch and necessary to endure. Marsh was tried in federal court and convicted on 14 counts. The trial took 6 weeks and produced testimony from Sauer, Fell, and Strand that was, by the reporting that covered it, methodical and devastating. The evidence package from Unit 114, both the primary folder and the red label secondary, was entered into evidence in its entirety. The financial records documenting the flow of procurement fraud proceeds directly to accounts controlled by Marsh's network of shell entities. The falsified safety certifications were entered alongside the equipment failure reports from field operations, and the correlation between the two was the kind of thing that didn't require expert interpretation. It was visible to anyone in the courtroom who looked at both documents simultaneously. 23 soldiers, 23 names. Strand read them into the court record on the trial's 4th day, and the courtroom was quiet in the specific way. Courtrooms were quiet when something had been named that had previously only existed as a number. Marsh was sentenced to 22 years. He was 61 years old. 4 months after the incident, Sauer came back to Ardmore Regional. Not as a patient. He walked through the front entrance on a Tuesday morning in civilian clothes, looking better than he'd looked the last time she'd seen him, still carrying the evidence of what he'd been through, because bodies remembered what they'd survived and didn't always let you survive and didn't let you forget it, but upbeat and present and moving with the deliberate ease of someone who had done significant work to get back to functional. He found her on the 4th floor at the nurse's station, in the middle of a chart review that was considerably less dramatic than the one that had started all of this. "You didn't leave a forwarding address," he said. "I work here. It's not hard to find." He sat in the chair beside the station, the family consultation chair that occasionally migrated to the wrong location, and looked at the floor for a moment, then at her. "The trial is over." "I know." I followed it. "Strand asked me to deliver something in person." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, not sealed, not formal, just a standard envelope with her name on it, in handwriting she didn't recognize. "It's from the families. A few of them, specifically. The ones who wanted to write." She looked at the envelope. She took it and held it without opening it. "You don't have to read it now," he said. "I know." She set it on the counter beside the chart. "I'll read it when I'm not at the station." He nodded. He looked around the floor, the nurses moving, the cart in the hallway, the ordinary dense activity of a functional hospital unit. "How's it been?" "Coming back." "Fine," she said. Then, because fine was the wrong word, and he was the kind of person who would know it, odd. "Not because anything is different, but because I keep expecting it to feel different. It doesn't. It's the same floor, the same work, the same things that need doing." "Is that bad?" She thought about it. "No, I think that's the point. The work doesn't change because the circumstances were extraordinary. The work is the work." She looked at him. That's what I was doing the morning this started. Just doing the work." He was quiet for a moment. "I know. That's what I told Strand. That's what she told the court." He paused. "It's in the trial record. What you did, how you did it. Not as a footnote, as the inciting event that made everything else possible." She didn't have a response to that wasn't either too small or too large, so she didn't offer one. "The Lockbridge Protocol," he said. "Vass filed a recommendation that your service record be formally updated to reflect your role in the research program's development. The classification has been partially lifted for purposes of the official record." He looked at her steadily. "You should receive formal documentations within the next few weeks. Your military service will reflect what you actually did." She had spent 7 years carrying a military record that described her service in terms designed to obscure what her service had actually been, because the program she'd worked on was classified, and classification required omission, and omission had a way of making people look smaller than they were. She had carried that, not bitterly. She'd understood the necessity, but as a specific kind of weight that had no good place to put down. "Okay," she said. It was a small word for a large thing, and she meant it in full. He stood up. He was a tall man, and he looked better than he had in the ICU, and she was genuinely glad about that, in the straightforward way. She was glad when a patient recovered rather than didn't, because that was the job, and the job mattered to her independently of everything else. "One more thing," he said. He pulled a second document from his jacket, this one folded, formal, with a letterhead she could read from where she was. "The DoD seal. The hospital's administration received a request last week from the Army Medical Department. They want to establish a formal consultation relationship with Ardmore Regional's nursing staff for tactical medical response training, recognition of chemical and neurological agents in civilian settings, identification of field compounds in trauma presentations." He held it out to her. "They ask that you be named as the primary clinical consultant, if you want it." She looked at the document. She didn't take it yet. "It's not a full-time position," he said. "It's a consulting designation. You'd keep your nursing role." The training program would be built around what you already know, structured for civilian medical staff. A pause. You'd be building something that doesn't exist yet. A bridge between field medicine and civilian trauma response. The kind of thing that might have made today's situation identifiable without requiring someone with your specific background to walk into a trauma bay uninvited. She thought about the trauma team then. The way they'd been running a neuroassessment without the vocabulary to understand what they were looking at, not because they lacked competence, but because the knowledge required to identify it lived in a different world than the one they'd been trained in. She thought about what it would mean to give civilian nurses and trauma physicians the vocabulary, not to make them soldiers, just to give them the pattern recognition that might matter in the specific rare situations where it mattered enormously. She thought about everything she'd carried for 7 years that had looked, from the outside, like nothing in particular. She took the document. "I'll need to review the terms," she said. "Of course. And I'll need it to not interfere with my floor schedule. I'm not leaving this floor. That was specified in the request." "Then I'll think about it." He looked at her. The look had the same quality as the one from the ICU measuring something, arriving at a conclusion. You already decided," he said. "I'm thinking about it," she said, and the corner of her mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, and both of them understood it. He left. She watched him go, then turned back to the chart review she'd been in the middle of, because the work didn't stop for significant moments, and she'd long since stopped needing it to. She read the letters from the families that evening, at her kitchen table, with the kind of attention that things like that deserved, not quickly, not skimming, but fully. There were 4 of them. Each one was specific. Each one named a person rather than a statistic. Each one said, in different words and different degrees of formality, the same essential thing we didn't know for a long time, and now we know. And knowing, as hard as it is better than not knowing. She sat with them for a long time after she finished reading. There was no clean way to hold the weight of someone else's loss without feeling it, and she'd never had much patience for the idea that distance was wisdom. You could be a competent nurse and a competent medic and a competent human being and still feel the weight of things that had cost people more than you. That wasn't weakness. That was just the tax that came with caring enough to do the work correctly. The consulting designation paperwork was on the table beside the letters. She hadn't signed it yet. She would sign it in the morning, after she slept, because decisions made at the kitchen table at 10 at night deserved the respect of a clear head and a regular time of day. But she already knew what she was going to do. She was going to build the program. She was going to take every piece of knowledge she'd carried in classified silence for 7 years and translate it into civilian trauma and nurses and emergency physicians could use. She was going to build the bridge between the world she'd worked in and the world she'd come back to, because the gap between those worlds had almost cost Sauer his life and had cost 23 soldiers their lives years before that. And gaps that cost lives were the kind of thing she didn't know how to look at without thinking about whether they were closable. They were closable. That was the thing. Not easily, not without sustained effort, not without the particular difficulty of doing work that nobody sees until the moment it matters, but closable. Most things were, if the right person stayed in the room long enough. She had stayed in the room. She put the letters away carefully, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. In the morning, she would sign the paperwork. She would go to the 4th floor. She would do her rounds. She would read her patient charts with the same attention she'd been bringing to them for 3 years, and she would flag anything that looked wrong. And she would keep flagging it regardless of who told her to stop. Because that was who she was, and she'd spent enough of her life in enough difficult situations to have stopped apologizing for it. She had been dismissed on a Tuesday morning for doing exactly what she was trained to do. She had walked out of a building with her badge on the desk and a suspension on her record and the knowledge, firm and unambiguous that she had been right. She had walked back in. That was the whole of it, really. The part that mattered. Not the classified background, or the Lockbridge Protocol, or the federal investigation, or the 22-year sentence handed to a man who had built a network of concealment around the deaths of people nobody powerful had been looking after. Those things were real, and they mattered, and the world was different because of them. But the hinge point the moment everything turned on was a nurse who knew a medication order was wrong and said so, and kept saying so, and when the door closed on her, found the side entrance and came back anyway. There was always a next thing to try. She had known that since long before the army, since long before Ardmore, since some early version of herself had learned that the gap between what was right and what was being done was a space that required somebody to stand in it, was a prey. And that the somebody was frequently going to be whoever was paying close enough attention to see the gap in the first place. She'd been paying attention her whole life. She wasn't going to stop.